Hi everyone, in this tutorial we're going to build a greeting card mockup from the tabletop up using tools that can all be found within Designer. Since there aren't that many mockups out there created in Affinity for Affinity, I'm on a mission to teach you as many ways as possible to make your own, because being able to create your own scene from the surface up allows you to control the overall feel of the mockup and customize it as needed. Now I am in the desktop version of Affinity Designer version 2, but if you know where the tools are located, you should be able to follow along on the iPad version. You can also use either Publisher or Photo and accomplish the same thing. Let's get started. I want to create a canvas that I can use in an Etsy listing, and I have a preset all set up here. I'm using a page width of 2,700 pixels and a page height of 2,025 pixels. I'm setting my DPI up to 300 just in case I want to print it, but I can export it at a lower DPI for screen. My color format is RGB because for the most part I am going to be using this on screen, and if I do print it, it's going to be through an RGB printer. Ultimately, I want to save this as a template once it's complete. So I want to create my canvas to be as versatile as possible so I can use it in various scenarios without a lot of rework. The layout for this mockup is relatively simple. I like to keep mockups for stationery pretty simplistic because I think it should be about the art on the greeting card or the notebook, not the surrounding elements. Those should all be complementary and not at all distracting. I'm going to create an envelope using a combination of flat vectors, texture, and drop shadows, as well as a placeholder for a card. The only other elements are the wood in the background and these two PNG elements. I'm going to be creating a mockup for a 5x7-inch greeting card that I can use for either my illustrations or my photographic work. Create yours to whatever size or orientation works best for your needs. I'm going to begin by creating a rectangle the exact size of my canvas. Now the color doesn't matter, it's just a placeholder. I want to be able to use my gradient tool to add an image background from the stock studio or externally and swap it out easily whenever I want. But the gradient tool needs something to fill first. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool and command click on my canvas. Now if you're on the iPad version, you don't have this option, but of course you can grab the rectangle and just drag it out. So again, I want this to be the size of my canvas. So for the width, I'll key in 2,700 pixels, and for the height, 2,025, and I'll click OK, and then center this up using my alignment options. I want to pull an image from the stock studio to add a wood background that can act as a desk. And again, I need to make sure that I don't choose anything that has a lot of distracting elements, in this case, big knots or large gouges in the wood, because I don't want any of the supporting elements to distract from the main objects. So I'm going to click on the layer and then select my gradient tool. I'll go to my stock studio and in the search I'll key in wood. I don't want anything too dark, I want something nice and light. I'm going to go to pixels and I like this white wood here, so I'm going to click on it and it's automatically going to place it. I often get asked why I don't just drag in from the stock studio or place it, and I could certainly do that, that's an option. But when you do that, you have to size it down and place it exactly where you want it. By using the gradient tool, it automatically places it. And in the case of something like this greeting card, it actually places it in the angle that your shape is already in. I'm going to use these handles here to just sort of size this up a little bit. I'm going to scale it and then maybe move it down. I'll go to my layers and I'm going to lock this into place so I don't accidentally move it around. Now that the background's in place, I'm going to begin creating the greeting card elements, starting with the envelope. My envelope is going to be made up of 3 layered shapes: the background element, and then these 2 rounded triangles that make up the top flap and the bottom pocket. Now, normally an envelope would also have 2 additional flaps on the side that, along with this bottom one, create that pocket. But since we're looking at this top down, you actually can't see it. So I'm not going to create something I don't need. Whenever you're doing something like this, especially when you're adding texture, don't create shapes that you don't need, because you're just needlessly adding to the size of your canvas. So I'm just going to stick with these 3. I'll start with that main background shape. I want to add a rectangle that's 2,100 pixels wide by 1,500 pixels tall. That's 5 by 7 inches. It's going to be much larger than I need, but I know that it's the right aspect ratio for a 5 by 7 inch greeting card. If I were just doing this with a surface pattern where I can tile it and move things around, it wouldn't much matter. But since I know that I'm going to be using this for either an illustration or a photograph, I want to make sure that I can share the entire thing without cutting anything off. So I'll go to my rectangle tool and I'm going to command click on the canvas. Now it's automatically adding it in the last size I used and the last fill. So again, I want this to be 2,100 pixels wide by 1,500 pixels tall. I'll click OK, and I'm just going to change the fill to this pink color. It doesn't matter what color I choose because I'm ultimately going to be swapping this out with texture. I'm going to create all of the shapes that I need first, then I'll start adding the texture and shadowing, and when I do that, I'll size this down and rotate it to where I want. So the next thing I want to create is the top flap. I'm just going to Command J to duplicate the shape that I just created. I'll go to my color panel and I'm just going to make this slightly darker. Since I don't have any shadows in place, if I use the same color, I'm not going to be able to see any difference. So I just want to make it slightly darker so I can see what I'm doing. I'll bring this up to about there, I think 250 pixels or somewhere around there. And then I'm going to grab my triangle tool and just drag out a triangle. That's the width of my canvas. I want to flip this vertically, so I'll go up to the top here and flip vertical, and then I'm just going to pop this up into place and deselect it. I just want to see the depth that I have here. I want to make this a little bit longer. So we're right about there. And then I'm going to select both shapes and take them from 2 pieces to 1 by going up to the top and clicking on Add. I'm going to use this and duplicate it to create my bottom piece, but before I do that, I want to round up some of these corners. So I'm going to hit C on my keyboard to select the corner tool. I can also select it here in my tools. And for this one, I'll click on it and just bring it up a little bit. And then I'm going to click and drag over these two, and I want to round them off a lot more than that other one. I want a little bit of straight edge along the top corner, but I want it to sort of pull away as it curves out. All right, I like how that looks. I need to bake the appearance of this shape. That's basically like setting these corners. If I don't do that and I scale this up and down, these are going to keep rounding the corners in different ways and it's going to end up looking wonky. So I'm just going to click Bake Appearance and it's going to set those rounded corners with nodes. Okay, I'm going to Command J to duplicate that shape, and again, I'll just make it slightly darker. Flip that horizontal, and I'm just going to bottom align that. I prefer to add texture to my shapes before adding the shadows because in reality, there is no pure black shadow unless it's on a pure black shape. So I'm going to be placing a craft paper texture that I add a warm filter to. So I want to be able to sample from that texture to set the right color for the shadows underneath the envelope. Now adding the texture is going to be really easy. I'm going to pull a craft paper texture from the stock studio using the gradient tool, and then I'm going to add that color overlay. I only need to add it to one of the 3 shapes, and then I'll use the style picker to add it to the other 2. So I'm going to select this top one, and I'll go to my stock studio, grab my gradient tool, and I want to type in craft paper. Now there's one here in Pexels that I like by Reusable. I'll go ahead and click on that. And again, it's automatically going to add it. Now you can see it's added it where I have a line showing there and it's kind of squashed. So I need to fix that. I'll go up to the top and I'm just going to click on Reset Transform. And that's done its job. I don't need to do anything else from here. If I wanted to, I could unlock the aspect ratio and drag the handles out by themselves a little bit more, but I like how this looks, so I'm going to leave that alone. I want to add a color overlay next. I find this is a little bit dull, a little bit cold, so I'm going to, with that layer selected, go to my layer effects and add a color overlay. Now it's automatically going to add that in black, but I can easily change that. So I'll click into this color dot here, and I'm going to go into my swatches and just pick an orange color. I want to make that a little darker, so I'll go up to my HSL sliders within this and just drag it down a little bit. And I'm going to change the blend mode within the layer effect to soft light and click close. Like I mentioned before, I only need to do this with one, and then I can automatically add it to the other two, so I don't have to go through all of those steps again. What I'm going to do is select my next shape and choose the Style Picker tool. Now, what you're going to see when you first pull it up is that you're going to have a number of options here that are all going to be checked off. What these are telling Designer is what you actually want to sample. In this case, I want to sample the fill, the craft paper texture, and the layer effect I added to it. I don't need anything else. So I'm just going to click on none and go back and only choose those two. So now you'll see this blue outline around the shape, which means that the style picker is ready to go. I'll click on this one and it's automatically going to add it. I don't need to I don't need to stretch it out. I don't need to add the color overlay. Everything is already there. Now I want to add it to the background rectangle, but there's an additional step I have to take first. Whenever you use the style picker, in between each pick, you need to unload the picker. So at the top here, you'll see empty picker. I'm going to go ahead and unload that. And now that blue outline is showing up. So I'm going to sample from here and it's added it to that bottom rectangle. Now, of course, I have no shadows in place here, so you can't see any difference between any of them, especially because they're all at the same scale. So let's go ahead and start adding some of the shadows so we can see some dimension. Now, before I start adding my shadows, I do want to note that off camera, I've gone ahead and named my layers. Whenever you're working with something like this, especially when you get into a more complex mock-up, it's a lot easier to have named layers than everything being named curve. So let's talk about some of the considerations when adding shadows. The first thing that I want to do is select all of my envelope shapes, and I want to size this down and rotate it in the direction that I ultimately want it, because that's going to determine how I add my shadows here. So I'll grab my move tool and I'm just going to go up to the handle up here and just rotate this to about -105. I can always change it. I'll go to my transform panel. I want to lock the aspect ratio because when I click and drag down, I want everything to stay as is. I don't want it to size funny. So I'm going to bring it right about there, I think. Maybe I'll make it a little bit bigger. I want it to rotate so this is the top flap and this is the bottom. The greeting card is going to be sitting in here. I feel like this top flap could be a little bit longer, so I'm going to just drag that out a little bit. I don't need to adjust the texture, although in looking at that, I think I will because that's a very obvious pattern. So I'm going to hit G for my gradient tool and just move that over. So now I have it sized down, I have it rotated. When you're adding drop shadows, there are a few things that you want to think about besides the direction of your object. The first is you want to think about where your assumed light source is coming from, because most of your shadows should follow the same direction. So I'm going to treat this as if my light source is coming from the top left, which means the majority of my shadows are going to be down and to the right. However, because this is technically a flat lay and we're looking top down, I also need to add slight shadows to some of the other elements. So you can see here, I have a pretty even shadow all the way around this flap, because if I was looking at this from the top, in order to see that dimension, there would be a slight shadow along the very edge. I also want to think about the real life depths of the shapes that I'm adding my shadows to. Because in order to keep it realistic, I need to consider that the drop shadow can differ depending on the thickness of what it's being added to. So that's why I've created this in 3 separate shapes rather than just adding a drop shadow under the entire thing and leaving it at that. All of these considerations are going to give both the envelope and ultimately the greeting card more realistic dimension. I'm going to start with the drop shadow underneath the entire envelope, so this one right here. Ultimately, this is going to be one of the deeper shadows because in real life, this envelope is either 2 to 3 layers of paper. So the drop shadow needs to be nice and deep, and again, down and to the right because my light source is coming from here. I'll select this bottommost shape and I'm going to click on the FX Studio because I already have that color overlay. I don't need to go down to the bottom here. I'm going to click to add an outer shadow. Now it's automatically giving me a pure black shadow, but again, I want to sample the colors so I can set it a little bit more appropriately. So I'm going to click into here and grab this picker, and I'll just find one of the darker colors here. I'll go right about here, I think, and click that dot to engage it. And I want to bring it down just a little bit. I'm bringing the luminosity down. I use the HSL slider more than anything else because I really just find myself adjusting either the saturation or the luminosity. So I think that's actually the most helpful one. I'm just going to bring this down, and I think I'll bring some of the saturation out of it. I don't want it to look maroon. I don't want it to be pure black, but I also don't want it to be light brown. All right, I think that looks good. One thing I want to do so that I don't have to do this again is to either write down these numbers, or I'm going to go up to the RGB hex slider and just Command C to copy that. That way I can apply it to the other shapes. So I want this to have a nice deep offset. I'm going to bring it down. You can see my angle is exactly where I need it. So this is as if the light is coming from this direction. So I'll bring the offset down. I might adjust it like that to about 300, and then I'll bring the radius up. I think I'm also going to bring the intensity up a little bit. And one more thing I might do is add another drop shadow that's a little bit more, it's closer to the envelope itself. So I'm going to click on that, go to the bottom one, and I'm just going to bring the offset in very tight to the envelope and bring the radius in as well. I think I'll bring the intensity up a little bit. This is all non-destructive. If at the end of this I don't like it, I can always change it. It's a matter of sort of playing around until it looks the way you want it. I'm going to add one more shadow to the top here. Again, if I were looking this from the top down, there would still be a slight shadow even though I have a light source coming from here. So I'm just going to click on this plus sign. Again, I want to change the angle of it. This time I want to drag it up here so that my light source is kind of coming up this way. And I'm going to bring this in really close. So I'm bringing the offset in. It's just going to be a slight shadow around the edge. So right about there. And I'll click close. I think that's a good start. Again, I can always go back in and add it. It's a little intense, but that's not a bad thing because if I use this at a smaller size, you'll still be able to see it. The next thing I want to do is add a shadow to this bottom flap. So I'm going to go into my FX and click to add a shadow. Now this is the one where it's going to be very minimal and it's going to be even all the way around because this is the one that you're looking at from top down. The light direction doesn't really matter. So I'm going to click into here first, and I want to paste that hex code in there so that I have that exact brown color. I'm going to keep the offset right where it's at and just bring the radius up slightly. So again, that's making it so that it's not further down on this side than this one. It's even all the way around, but you can still see it. And I think I might bring the intensity up just a touch. All right, there we go. So I'm going to click close. All right, and then finally I want to add to this top flap. Now this top flap is going to look as if it's sitting above and much higher than everything else. So I need a pretty deep shadow here. Ultimately, the greeting card is going to be tucked in here and have the shadow come across it. So I'll go back in here, and for this one, I'm going to add my first shadow. I want to change it, of course, to the brown. And I might make this a little bit darker. Let's bring that down a little bit. I want to bring my offset up pretty high, but you can see what's happening is it's going out the bottom right. I actually want that really deep shadow right here. So I'm going to take the angle and I'm going to move it this way. I'm going to bring the radius up. And I'm not worried about that spillover because that's coming from here. I'm going to keep it right where it's at. I'll bring the intensity up just a little bit. Now, The problem with this is it is adding to my drop shadow, but the great thing about having multiple drop shadows is I can adjust the other ones to compensate. I don't have any good way of controlling this, so as I make this larger, it's coming out on this side. I'm just going to go back into the others and adjust them to knock them down a touch. All right, so I want something coming out this side too, but not quite as high as this one because it wouldn't make sense. If I was looking at it here, this side would be a little bit deeper. So I'll just go ahead and click plus to add that second shadow. I'm going to bring the angle up to 90 degrees. I want it to the top here, but I don't want it to be that deep. So I'm going to bring the offset all the way in to right about there and bring the radius in a lot. All right. I think I'm going to go back to this one and just play around with it a little bit more. Maybe make it a little darker. Bring the radius up a little bit more. And maybe use the opacity slider. Okay, now that I have that in place, again, I want to knock this one back a little bit. It's spilling over into the drop shadow behind the whole thing. So I'm going to click close on that. I'll go back into the bottom one. And I think I don't want to turn that one off. I think I'm going to turn off, let's see. I'm going to bring this one down a little bit. I think I'm just going to knock the opacity down and maybe bring the offset in a little bit. And I'll go into this one. Sometimes it's just a matter of playing around with them to see what works best. This is the one that's up here, so I'm going to leave that alone. This one, I'll knock the intensity down and the radius, and I'll just bring the opacity down a little bit. All right, let's just back out of this. I'm still not liking that. I think I'm going to turn this one off. This top one, I'm just going to delete it. And again, I'll just bring the opacity on this one down. All right. I think that looks a lot better. Again, I can always adjust it once I have everything in place, but I like how this is looking. So I want to go ahead and add some highlights just to finish this off. I want to take one final step with this and just add a subtle highlight along the edge of this flap. If it was actually sitting up like this, because the light's coming down from here, this is actually going to be above the greeting card, which means the very edge of this would have a slight glow to it. So I'm going to select this top flap and go back into the layer effects. Let me just zoom in here so you can see what's happening. I'm going to turn on inner glow and just bring the radius up a little bit. I want to bring the intensity down. I don't need it to be as intense. I also want to make sure that it's on edge and not center, because that's what happens when it's at the center. And let me see what happens when I change this to soft light. I feel like screen was a little too intense. I think soft light's working a little bit better. All right. Again, this is just an added dimension. You don't have to do this. It's just if you're going for realism, then there would really be an edge glow around that particular piece. All right, so I'm going to call that done. I could add one here as well. However, the greeting card is going to be over the top of that. So since I can't control it on this side, I'm not going to do that. I'll just leave this alone and just keep it here. So the next thing I want to do is create the placeholder for my greeting card. This is actually the easiest part of the mockup because it's really just one layer that we're going to add some shadows to. So I could go ahead and grab my rectangle tool and key in the 1500 by 2100 pixels. But since I already have this in place and it's already the right size, I'm just going to go ahead and Command J to duplicate that and take everything off of it. So I'm going to remove all of the effects. So I'll take the color overlay and the shadows off. And I'm just going to change this to a gray color. I want to move this out so that it's above the bottom flap, but beneath the top flap because I want the top flap sitting over it. And I'll just drag it out a little bit and then rotate it. I don't want too much of it covered by the flap of the envelope, but I just want some of it under it, just again, so there's some dimension there. I think right about there. It's going to look like this at the end. I could even tip it a little bit more. All right, so I'm ready to add my drop shadows. Now this would be thicker because a greeting card, of course, is 2 layers. You have the front and the back. I'm not going to show the back, but I am going to make the drop shadow give the impression of them one being there. So I'll click on this and I'm going to go to my FX. And I want to add an outer shadow. That brown is already in place because I used this to create it, but I think I'm going to make it a little bit darker. So let's bring that down. And I want to bring the offset down and to the right. Also going to bring the opacity up to about 50% and then bring the radius up. Maybe bring the intensity up as well, just a touch. I'm going to take this one that's already in place. Again, because I duplicated this, it's automatically giving me whatever was in here. I want to move this one up so that it's giving me my shadow up here. And I'm just going to bring the offset in as well as the radius. I just want it hugging the edge. I'm going to put an image in place because it's going to make it a little bit easier to see how this is looking. So I'll select that shape and choose my gradient tool. This is why I wanted to create a placeholder like this, because I can very easily swap images out simply by using the bitmap feature on the gradient tool the same way I did the texture. All right, so I have the greeting card in place. Now, just like this one, I actually want to add an inner glow to the edge of this. If you look at a card, because they're cut, you can usually see a little bit of a white line along the edge. This looks a little flat. So what I'm going to do is go into my FX and choose an inner glow. And it's going to end up adding it to the whole thing, but I'm just going to really focus right there. So I'll bring the radius up a little bit. I don't want it to be too deep. Again, I'm going to change this to soft light. All right, right about there. I like that. If I wanted to, I could add something that looks like the back is kind of tilting down, but I like this and I think it would be distracting to have anything else. So I'm going to move this down, I think, into the middle, and then add my 2 final elements to this. Just in looking at the shadows, I like how these are looking. I might find that I have to adjust things as I change whatever image I have here. The shadows might not be the right feel, or the color overlay might need to be changed, but for right now, I like how this looks. The 2 final things I want to add, I'm going to pull from my assets. I'm just going to pull in this PNG leaf shape. You don't have to do something like this, but adding things like this add a little bit of extra dimension that give a little sense of realism to it. So I'm going to place it over the top of it, but again, I don't want it to cover anything important on the actual greeting card. And then I'm also going to bring in this pen. This already has a shadow attached to it. If I need to, if I put this in a different place, I can always adjust it, but I think that looks good. I might just make the card just a touch bigger. So I'm going to go up to my transform panel and drag up. Maybe place it right there and then bring this back. And I'll move this guy right here. Okay, I just want to make sure that all of my layers are organized before I save this as a template. So I'm going to group these 2 up. These are going to be additional elements. Top flap is going to stay by itself because it needs to sit above this. The greeting card is fine. I'm going to group these 2 together just in case I need to size up and down. It'll just make the whole thing easier. So this is the bottom of envelope. And then I'm going to group up the entire greeting card. This way, if I share it with somebody, I can provide them instructions on how to access everything, but everything is nice and organized. Use fill to change image. And then I'll click on this and I'm going to use fill to change background. Now, before I save this as a template, I want to remove that image. So I'm going to go back to the greeting card, click on my gradient tool, and I'm just going to change this to gray. That's going to take it back to a neutral position, and then when I pull it in, I can always add whatever image I want. Now, technically, I could save this as an asset by grouping everything up and putting it in my assets here. The problem is I'm using textures, and even though there's only a few layers here, when enough textured layers or artboards get added to your assets, you'll start to see lag happen, and in some cases, especially on the iPad, crashes. Personally, I only save flat vectors or vector textures to my assets, and anything that has raster texture I'd rather save as a template. That allows me to open it up just like this, and it gives me a clean copy every single time with all of my layers, with all of my effects that added, without having to delete or replace a lot of unnecessary objects. I also don't run the risk of overwriting the original if I make any changes. Working with templates pulls in a clean copy, and the original document sits safely wherever you saved it. To save a template, you just go up to the top to File, down to Export as Template, name it, and place it wherever you want it. Now, I've already saved this, so I'm not going to do that again, but I actually have mine saved to a cloud file that I can access from any of the apps, whether on my desktop or on my iPad. So if I go up here to New, and on the desktop, you'll see this Templates. I have it saved right there. I can just pull it in, add my greeting card, export it, and again, the original template is left completely alone. So can you see yourself creating your own greeting card mockups in Designer? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, if you have any questions, let me know that as well. If you like my teaching style, consider checking out my full-length classes either on Skillshare or my own learning site, The Creator Collage. I've linked to both below. I have lots more Affinity tutorials in store for my channel. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn more about the Affinity Suite, you might want to check out one of these two next. Thanks for watching.